whilst I sort out these banners. Hi, Erica.
Hi.
Hi, nice to see you. Sorry, I was having a little bit of trouble there with some technical difficulties in the background, but I think I've sorted it out now. I can see you, you can see me.
Yes, how you doing, sis? I'm here. Glad to be here with you.
I'm good. I'm happy to be here with you as well. So we've had a few discussions about this talk today for GPAN, and it's the first Race, Racism and African Heritage show that's taking place today. And the topic that we're going to be discussing is connection to African heritage and the importance of being connected to African heritage. And I'm just going to no, I didn't know whether Angela, if she comes back in, I'll add her. She was asking if I needed help, which I did at the beginning, but it started out now. So we had some questions that we discussed between ourselves about what we wanted to talk about, and it's a difficult topic. Would you agree?
Yes, I will agree that it's a difficult topic, but a vital, important topic for us to discuss. I think it's just beneficial for our moving forward as an African diaspora. I think it's really productive and it needs to happen.
Yeah, I agree. I'm not going to try and make this about the recent Jessica Kruger revelation, but in a sense, I feel that that's going to feed in to some of the things that we talk about, because she identified as a biracial Black woman and was able to access all type of things which should have been for people who had African heritage, and how problematic that is going forward. But we have some questions, so we're going to discuss this. It's going to be about a 45-minute show. And then if there's any questions or comments that come up, I'll pull them up. Other than that, we'll just get going. So do you want to kick off? I can't even remember.
Yes. No, definitely. So I know that you had mentioned, we were talking, and you had mentioned that you reject the race classification of biracial. So can you tell us first a little bit like about your background, and then tell us, why do you reject the race classification of biracial or mixed race?
Yeah, that's no problem. So my name is Marsha Garrett, and I live in England in the Northeast in a predominantly white area. My father was a Jamaican man, and my mother, an English lady from a small town called Thirsk. Not long after I was born, my mother died from a brain aneurysm, and my father was incarcerated. So myself and my brother, both from the same parents, were adopted by two white parents. And so basically I've been surrounded by whiteness my entire life. Now, what's interesting, I think, for myself as a person who lives in England, is that when I was born in 1981, there wasn't a box on the UK census, which is the census that's designed to add up the population and see who's living here and what racial group you are. There was no mixed race box. So I was automatically classified as Black. The first time a box was introduced on the UK census was in 2001. And by this time, I'm 20 years old. So for 20 years, I'm identified as Black. And then all of a sudden now this box comes along, and now it's, oh, okay, now you're mixed race. And it got me to questioning, how can I just be switched like that? I didn't ask for that. And I don't see how it's beneficial for me. So I started doing some research into racial classifications. And it was within that I thought to myself, I don't recognize this term mixed race or biracial. So in the UK, it's more mixed race. The term is mixed race. I know in biracial is more popular in the States. And then you've got pardos in Brazil. There's sort of different terminology for a person who has a black parent and a white parent, depending on where you live. But for me, any additional racial category simply evolves the concept of race. And the concept of race was designed by white supremacy for white supremacy. It's so for me to embrace that term, mixed race, would be to evolve the concept of race, which denigrates people of African origin. And I also feel that it's an insidious way of divide and rule, which is something that white supremacy has done ever since the concept of race was created, and colonialism and racialized slavery. Divide and rule amongst people of African heritage for fear of people of African heritage. So if I embrace that term, it's me distancing myself from my African heritage. It's not about being correctly identified, because if somebody said to me, well, who's your family? I would say I have a black father and a white mother. But to embrace that term as mixed race, for me, feels like a move away from love of my African ancestry. I would rather identify as black or black mixed. So in the UK, on the census form, underneath mixed race, you have white at the top as a classification. Then underneath you have mixed race, then you have Asian, and then you have black. And when I very first started reviewing the census, I thought, oh, well, it makes sense that white would be at the top because white is the biggest population in the UK. So it makes sense. The next biggest population is actually Asian. It's not mixed race. So why were we slotted in there? And then when you understand the racial socioeconomic hierarchy that was created during colonialism and racialized slavery, it fits in with that racial hierarchy. So it's placing mixed race above Asian and black because of our proximity to whiteness. So again, it's a way of reinforcing the concept of race and the idea that white is naturally superior. Also on the UK census, the term white comes first. So it will say white and black Caribbean, white and black African, white and Asian. And I find that interesting as well, that they have to then break it down into Caribbean and African, which again, for me is part of division. The fact that white comes first is in that word white. It implies that white is more important than than a secondary African parent. So I reject those terms on the basis that they evolve the concept of race, which was designed to develop and support a white supremacist system, which is tied into capitalism as well. So I reject those terms on that. I didn't create them. It's presented almost to us that the government kindly recognized our existence in the UK by including us on a box. Well, we know that's not true because the British government at one time ruled Jamaica, and they had those separate racial categories in Jamaica when it was a colonial, when it was colonial ruled and when it was a slave planter society. So it's always been there. It's just now the need for black mixed people to identify separate to black is important to the white establishment. As the white birth rate decreases, I feel that mixed race, that term, and people who embrace that term are being primed to take forward the idea and the concept of race and natural white superiority. That's what I feel. So that's why I reject those terms.
Yes, I think I agree with you. I agree with you 100% because, as you stated, the majority, actually, the majority is people of what you would describe as mixed race or class, or as the government would classify as mixed race. And as you stated, it is in the favor of white supremacy for them to have more numbers. There's more power in numbers. So if you're in the mixed race and you can identify as white, it's easy to say, well, identify as white because it increases their numbers. Because really, we make up mixed race and individuals who are not of mixed race, but are like, I guess people may say, pure African blood, make up the majority globally in the world. And so that's an important thing to note, because if we unite, and we unite on the basis of our origins, of our African roots and origins, then really we would be the majority and we can overpower this system of white supremacy. So I agree with you 100%. You know, you mentioned your thoughts when people, tell you that you should identify as mixed race. Why do you think is you also mentioned a little bit about why it's problematic, but I want to hear more about why do you think it's problematic for one person with one black parent versus and one white parent to identify as black?
Yeah, this one for me is really interesting, actually, because in discussions that I've had with people, various people, about the importance of black being a sort of exclusive group. On one hand, I understand, but on the other, when someone says to me, well, you're not black because you have a white parent, I always question, and I ask them directly, are you saying that though because that's what white supremacy has taught you? Because if you're saying to me, well, to be black, you must have two black parents, well, that was the category, that was the classification that was designed by white supremacy. They said that. That's what white supremacy said. So going back to Jamaica as a slave planter society, the racial categories were based on your proximity to whiteness. So I argue that's still in play when someone says to me that you cannot identify as black. Yeah, I read an interesting tweet that got me thinking, where a man wrote, the problem with, and it was specific to women as well, the problem with mixed race people identifying as black, mixed race women identifying as black, is that they then push out darker skinned women, or full black women, if you will, for this purposes of this conversation, from having a platform. And on one hand, I can see his point, absolutely. And that ties into colorism 100%. So I think that's accurate. But at the same time, would we say the same thing of light-skinned women who do have two black parents? Because they are also given platforms and promoted as the acceptable black. So I think I wouldn't, for me, because of the fact that I've taken it upon myself to really study and research race, racism, the myth of white supremacy, but the reality of a white supremacist system, for me, I don't think it is problematic, but I can see how it could be in other arenas. I really can. So I watched a documentary before that was it was called Complexion Obsession, and it was about women in hip hop videos, the models in hip hop videos. And there were so many light-skinned women. Some of them were light-skinned, some of them had white heritage, and then there were some darker-skinned women. And they were talking about the opportunities that they get in videos based on their complexion and perceived proximity to whiteness. And there's no doubt that the lighter-skinned women and the women with white heritage were getting the lead roles, they were being paid more, and they were also getting more work. So, and a lot of them identified as black is my point. So I can see how it could be problematic in that sense, but I suppose for someone who is passionate about dismantling the white supremacist system, for me it feels like unity to identify as black. I don't see it as problematic. For me it feels like love to identify as black. I don't see it as problematic, as long as I'm always conscious that I will be offered platforms that a darker skinned person wouldn't be offered on account of my light skin and proximity to whiteness. However, once I open my mouth, I speak the truth. I speak the truth of how I see a white supremacy. I'm not going to sit here and say, problem because I'm pretty or something ridiculous. I'm not going to say that, because that's precisely what white supremacy would want me to say. Now, because of this, I've been blocked from certain platforms because I won't speak as a white supremacist system would want me to. I won't relax my hair. I've been told on a few occasions after doing a television interview, if you relaxed your hair, you know, you'd get more work, you'd look a little bit more racially ambiguous. I'm not doing that. I'm embracing my African heritage. So I think the moment that, but unfortunately, I'm digressing a little bit here, but unfortunately, in the white supremacist system on mainstream media, they will give the platforms to Black mixed people who go, yeah, I had it so tough, you know, rejected from this, rejected from that. There's always this problematic angle that they love Black mixed people to promote. It's not a problem for us, it's a problem for the white supremacist system. And that's what we must recognize. We are a problem to the white supremacist system. We are not inherently as a problem. And we should use that in power. And I think that power comes by identifying, connecting with our African heritage.
Yes, I mean, there's this quote that says, only fools build divisiveness, and the wise build bridges. And I think it's about, you know, understanding how you stated this conversation is mostly happening with individuals that come from, you know, societies that were slavery enterprises, right? So we are the descendants of these societies that were slave enterprises, and now we're having this conversation about, are you Black? Are you Black enough? And the truth of the matter is, historically, if we go back to the origins of where this began, it began during the times of the transatlantic slave trade, where colonizers were obviously raping slaves, and when the children were born, they would not claim any children that had any African blood, which obviously would have African blood because they were raping our ancestors, unfortunately. So the children that were born, some of them may have had, you know, very evident African features, and others may have not had any African features physically, but still had the African blood. And I think it raises this issue of confusion within our African diaspora, which is okay and is why we need to speak about it. But historically, the slave master did not identify those children as their children, even if those children had some of their features, because they knew that those children had African blood because they came from the raping of a slave. And so those children were closer to their African heritage, period, because they were being raised and they were being taught by their parent who was enslaved, because they weren't considered a part of the white community, right? They were exiled from that community, and some of those individuals were labeled as quadroons or mulattoes, which we sometimes utilize today and can be you know, can be considered a derogatory term to some. But you know, back then, that is how they identified, you know, this person had African blood. So a quadroon had 25% African blood, and then a mulatto had from 25 to 50% African blood, right? So for example, I would fall in the category of a mulatto, and I have predominantly African features, right? And you fall in the category of a mulatto, and I mean, I have predominantly European features. You fall in the category of a mulatto, and you may have some more African features than me. So that in itself, in looking within our community, we know that by sight, you're unable to see really who's of African descent. But we do know that you are of African descent, right? And historically, Europeans wanted to breed only with Europeans because they wanted to keep the African bloodline out, right? So now when you have the descendants of this slave enterprise, these are African people of African origins that really don't have any connection to the colonizers, even if they may have some of their features, because they share their African heritage with their African great grandparents, right? So, and for example, I'll just use myself as an example. My African bloodline, which I actually went and tested, comes from Senegal, right? I'm a mulatto. It comes from Senegal. So somewhere in my bloodline, there is an African ancestor who was from Senegal and obviously was raped, right? And over the years, living on the same island, I'm from the Dominican Republic. My family is from the Dominican Republic. And in general, if you meet people from the Dominican Republic, you will find that in one intermediate family, you can have, a brother and a sister who is two totally different hues. You can have one that's my hue, and then you can have a sister that is like fully melanated, with more Afrocentric features. You can have one parent that may have some European features and another parent who doesn't. And over the years, as they're intermingling, you'll see that this obviously will affect the way that Africans look today. So people of African descent look very different today, but they're still of African descent. And the important part to tie into is the African heritage, right? The lack of connection to the colonizer or European culture, period, right? So for example, in my culture, in my heritage, we eat spices, rice and beans, we dance merengue, perico ripiao, very Afrocentric music, foods, and so forth. So there's no connection to the European colonizers. We have Santeria, which is a branch off of voodoo, which is a branch off of our African spirituality and religion. So, we have carnival, we have statues in the Dominican Republic honoring our African heroes, right? Even though, there's been some controversy about prejudices and biases towards one another in our communities. Um, this is going to be an issue that we have to speak about. And colonizers created this problem on purpose. Literally, African slaves were enslaved Africans were the majority on the island. When they dropped off the first slaves onto Hispaniola, onto the Caribbean, there were 90% of African slaves dropped off onto the island. And it's very odd when you go onto Wikipedia, which is not a reliable source. You go on there and it's describing the heritage of the people on that island as mixed race, and it doesn't show how they're really predominantly African, which is interesting because if you really look at it historically, it's impossible that they're not predominantly African when 90% of the people on that island were African slaves. So they created this race classification where they breeded certain slaves together. They literally treated our ancestors like animals. They had this is how the issue of the field slave versus the house slave also came about. We've been basically going back and forth with each other in terms of blackness and who's black enough for centuries, right? And really, if there was no white supremacy, we would not have this issue.
Yes.
So our focus should be targeted towards the origin of the problem versus towards blaming and shaming and excluding one another. Because the truth of the matter is we are of African descent and we are more connected than anything else. We all really don't have a connection to the European other than a traumatic connection due to its slavery, right? And I think that it's important that as you're learning your history and you're a Pan-Africanist, that you learn world history. You have to learn the dynamics of what's going on in other parts of the world, in the Caribbean, where the transatlantic slave trade happened, in the Americas, where the transatlantic slave trade happened, in London, everywhere, because that will help you understand that really on a global level, if you go to Brazil, you will find people that their culture, their heritage is African, but they may look just like me, right? And you mentioned having your natural hair, right? There's some of our sisters that may put a weave in, and we always encourage natural beauty. But the truth of the matter is, you should move around in the world, beautifying yourself however you feel comfortable,
Yes.
without it being this big discussion and question mark as long as you embrace your African heritage and who you are. And once you know your African origins, even if you have European bloodline, you have a responsibility that if you have African blood and you understand what has happened in history, you have a responsibility to embrace your African heritage. You can't tell a person that is of mixed race that they should now breed and have children with a European counterpart and erase their African bloodline and heritage because you feel that they're not Black enough, right?
Yes.
But that doesn't discount the realities of what's going on. There are things such as white privilege, which you may benefit of, right?
Yeah.
Maybe I may benefit of. Like I support always my brothers and sisters of a darker hue, but and so in doing that, we have to be transparent and honest about the fact that they're receiving a level of discrimination that we won't receive, right? But also there's not a conversation about what kind of discrimination people that fall into the category that are people of African descent who are of a lighter hue that they receive. And they receive the kind of discrimination from their own people where they're rejected and told they're not Black enough. And then also they're also over sexualized, and so forth. I know that you have a lot of thoughts on that. So, share with us.
I think, you know what it is that what we'll see in the mainstream, and this is deliberately done by the white supremacist system, what we'll see in the mainstream is if it's a Black mixed person talking, oftentimes they're given this platform to talk, it won't be someone like me. It wouldn't have even been someone, say, like Frederick Douglass, who had been enslaved and then became an abolitionist. It wouldn't have been somebody like him either, because they were speaking the truth of the white supremacist system. What you will find is it will be people that have internalized the miseducation that we are given within the white supremacist system. So I've definitely seen Black mixed women, and they need to be very conscious of this, sitting there saying, well, Black women don't like us because we're pretty, and this is not our, and I can already feel my back get up, because I'm thinking, do you know where that comes from? This connection between Black mixed and exotic and pretty, do you know where it comes from? Because its origins are abominable. It comes from because white slavers and white planters decided that because we had white heritage, that we were prime meat for rape and abuse, which is the same that happened to Black women. And I had this conversation with a gentleman before, because he said, during slavery, you'd have been all right because you'd have been in the house. So you wouldn't have had it as bad as say, someone like myself or my sister of the same complexion. And then when I'm reading work produced by women who were house slaves, like Elizabeth Keckley, Harriet Jacobs, both of those wrote books. They were Black mixed women who were house slaves. When you read that, it gives you an understanding of where this horrible origins of this pretty exotic comes from. More money was spent on Black mixed women, but to be brought to be abused from being children. So what we should be recognizing is that abuse happened to Black women, and it happened to Black mixed and light-skinned women. It happened to us all. So like you said before, the focus should be on dismantling the white supremacist system, not arguing about you had it better during slavery, or your people have had it better. These women that lived in the house, they had to learn how to do their tasks quickly so they could get out of rooms fast before they were found, but whether it be by the master or his sons. And then because his wife often knew what was going on, she would then deliver her own set of punishment in the household, away from the field, people enslaved in the fields who weren't seeing it. She would deliver her own punishment. If a child was produced from that Black mixed woman and the master, she would know it came from her husband, so she would ensure that child was sent to the worst plantations. Now, am I saying this wasn't happening to Black people? Of course it was. It was happening to us all on account of our African heritage. And proximity to whiteness did not guarantee being saved. And like you said earlier, the majority of white males who had children with enslaved women did not free them. They did not free them. They were extra stock. And it was only when the recognition was coming that slavery was no longer viable as an economic system that some certain changes started to be made and certain privileges were offered. But those privileges, and I always argue, they're conditional. They're conditional on your assimilation to white supremacy. That's why a black mixed person who talks about how difficult it is in terms of being this pretty thing, but doesn't recognize the racist system and the racist history that underpins that, will be given a platform over somebody like myself. And we need to be aware of this history. This history needs to be shared massively. Frederick Douglass, when he was doing a talk, and another point, and I'm jumping all over here, but I'll come back to you, Darling. Frederick Douglass, when he was doing a talk, he identified as a black man. His father was his owner. He was never freed, and he lived his life enslaved and then escaped. When he was talking to a group of white people who were supposedly supporting the abolition movement, they said the reason why he's such a good speaker is because he's got white heritage. We need to be careful. If we identify as mixed race and going forward and embrace that and distance ourselves from our African heritage, any achievements that we make will be credited to our white ancestry as what white supremacy has done throughout history. And Frederick Douglass himself said, the way I speak and how I feel and my understanding comes from my African heritage, not my white heritage. So for me, yeah, but the origins of the pretty exotic are not good, and we shouldn't embrace it for a little bit now, you know, to get a little bit ahead, to get extra money, to take work. We should not embrace it. All we're doing is working for white supremacy when we do that.
Yes, exactly. And you know, there are some statements that I've heard, at least, that have been made. If you're not of a darker hue, you should not be speaking about this issue around blackness and colorism and so forth. But because, and I think that people make these sort of statements because they're afraid to have this discussion, because it's uncomfortable, because it's confusing. And I think that's the point. It's supposed to be confusing to the point that we can't unite, because we can't view one another as one. And that is only beneficial, obviously, to white supremacy.
Yes.
Otherwise, it would be of all the benefit to us to unite as one. And, you know, I've spoken with different you know, brothers and sisters, and you know, I've heard this idea of establishing a black nation with only Africans of the darkest hue to preserve the original African, right? And the fact of the matter is that there's not a lack of melanin, there's not a lack of we're not going extinct as a people of African descent. And if you have people that are descendants of the African enslaved slave trade, then you understand that these people, if they're conscious and they know their origins and they know their roots, then they need to interact and be in society with people of African origins as well. They cannot assimilate to European origins and just say, now I'm going to be white and take on this whole European identity that is really not a part of their upbringing, their history, who they are, their ancestry. Or
you've frozen for a minute there. I'm hoping that you'll come back, because I was really engaged with that. I'll carry on talking, and hopefully your camera will unfreeze and you'll come back. These are the type of things that happen when you go on StreamYard Live. I think that because I know that you wanted to talk more about some of the issues regarding our disunity as a people. It is massive. If we what we're having at the moment is we are having generations of children born with one black parent and one white parent who will only ever identify as biracial or mixed race because the white supremacist system has told them that. And it is the white supremacist system because they created the racial categories that we tick the boxes for. As that goes forward, what will happen is there'll be continuation of miseducation for those children. So what we saw in slaver and planter societies is if, and this was not a given, if a black mixed child was born free or given freedom, it was only because of recognition from their white parent. What that does is it creates a dependency on whiteness. So, and that is very useful for the white supremacist system going forward, because if we prioritize and identify, oh, I think I think you'll come back there. Yes, you froze for a second, but you're back now. You're moving. I can see you.
I'm like, what happened?
Finished. It just froze. I don't know what happened. I'm just going to very quickly finish this little point because I just carried on talking.
Okay.
If you have a dependency on whiteness, we will work for white supremacy. That's the issue. And people oftentimes talk about the one drop rule and say that when a black mixed person identifies as black, they're reinforcing the one drop rule, which was racist. The one drop rule had conditions to it. And this is what I talk about, conditional privilege for black mixed. The conditions were that in order to inherit, you had to have a white guardian. So again, there was still this creation of dependency on whiteness. The expectation would be that you would also marry a white person, and the money from your inheritance would go back into the white community. So it wasn't as straightforward as with the one drop rule, where it was a case of, okay, they were classified as black, and that's problematic for black people. It was to create dependency on whiteness, and we will still see that, and we still see that to this day. And it's part of the evolution of racism, and we must see that. We must recognize it's the evolution of racism. I apologize, man, because should I ask you some of the questions? Because you were on an absolute flow, and some of the questions.
Sure.
Should anyone in the African diaspora be silenced based on how melanated they are?
Well, no. And the reason why is because if you're identifying as black, then you most certainly must be identifying as being African, right? And if you are African, then what makes you African? And that's the question. What makes you African? And there are different types of Africans, right? There's Africans who were born on the African continent, right? There's Africans who were born from these enslaved enterprises, and they have descendants and unfortunately are products of colonization and raping and so forth. And then you have African Americans who are in the Americas who actually were transported from the Caribbean secondly, after the enslaved Africans were transported onto the Caribbean first. So, you know, being African is having African blood, right? And then we have to question, well, how much African blood makes you an African? Well, you know, that is something in our community that we need to discuss and we need to come to an understanding of. It doesn't have anything to do with how melanated you are, because again, how melanated you are doesn't reflect how much African blood you have, right? You could see me and maybe never guess that I have any African blood at all, but I am technically a mulatto. The way they would identify mulattoes when our enslaved history began. You know, you're technically a mulatto, but you are an African. You have African blood. Your ancestors are African. Your family is full of people who are both of a darker skin hue, of a lighter skin hue. So to say that, you know, what is black, what is being African, or you can't speak unless you're not melanated enough, really would silence individuals like myself from advocating for my own darker hue family members who may be experiencing that discrimination that other darker hue skin Africans speak about, that are of a darker hue and are discriminated against because of a darker hue. I have to stand with them, right? I can't pretend these are not my family, these are not my cousins, this is not my, you know, aunts, this is not my grandfather. If I do that, then I would not be true to who I truly am, right? So I think that if I stay quiet, then I'm really being disloyal, right? I'm really not being a part of my family. And I think that the part of the issue is that when you want to silence people of African descent of a lighter hue and tell them that they can't speak about these things, then you're really silencing your own people, because they're living in the same households with people of a darker hue. They're living in the same societies and they have the same origins and they share
whole life with people of African of a darker hue. So when you're telling them you can't speak about these issues, well, why? Because they've been witnessing it, right? You might have European looking hair, but your but your sister may have been born and had a little bit more African hair, and you may have watched what she experienced. You may be the shoulder she cried on. You may have a mother, right? When you have that one black parent, you may have seen your mother walk around in the world and experience it, and it affects you too, right? Just because it's not happening directly to you, but when it's happening to the person who birthed you, like in my case or in your case, or when it's happening to your loved one who is your intermediate family, it hits you just the same. It bothers you just the same. It matters to you wholeheartedly just the same. So I think you can't tell a person of a lighter hue that they should be silenced about these issues, because these issues affect them too. It's a part of their families. It's a part of who they are. And I think we need to let go of the assumption that when you look at somebody, how melanated they are tells you how black they are, right? Because I've met individuals of who are very melanated and fully not conscious. They don't even identify as African in America. I've met individuals who say I'm African American, but I'm not African. I think now it's when people are starting to embrace that, which is beautiful. And I encourage our people to come together, regardless of their melanin, to come together, period, to marry together, to have children together. If you're of African descent, you should come together. But I don't encourage the separation of people of African descent based on hue, because that would be discounting the true realities and traumatic experiences that happened to our ancestors and the product thereof, which is us today. We would not exist if the transatlantic slave trade didn't happen. We would not be here. Their whole society, the Dominican Republic, would not be there, right? So, we have to be honest and real about this. Yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but
I think it does beautifully. And I was just going to say that we also have to recognize that there are dark-skinned people who do not work for African liberation, for Black unity. They actively work for the white supremacist system. Malcolm X talked about that they will always find, I'm sure he said, some dumb Negro to put forward and say, this is the spokesperson for Black people. And we see this in Candice Owens. We see this in Thomas Sowell. They say things that actively work for the white supremacist system and put down blackness. So this whole thing of skin folk ain't your kinfolk. Not all skin folk are your kinfolk, and that's important. So they're absolutely, and I wholeheartedly agree with you. There absolutely is people of different skin tones who actively work against the white supremacist system and work to dismantle it. And it's about connecting with those people and working with those people, regardless of shade. And I'm sure that at the end of the ISIS papers by Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, and this has always stuck with me because it made sense. She was like, I am for every shade of black, in recognition that every shade of black, even if there is a proximity to whiteness, is still denigrated by the white supremacist system. It always brought it round full circle back to the cause of why we're even having these discussions, which is due to white supremacy. I'm going to put up a question that somebody, and I'll read it out if you can't read it on your screen. Can you see that, Erica?
Yes.
So the question was, can there be a successful movement for and by Black people while simultaneously excluding mixed light-skinned Blacks? Remember, at one time, light-skinned Blacks excluded darker-skinned Blacks on the basis of darkness in comparison with a brown paper bag, which is the brown paper bag test. Now, in my research, when I've looked at the brown paper bag test, that wasn't specific to Black mixed. It was also to people who had two Black parents as well. So it was about the light-skinned Black people. And as far as I'm aware, this was something that was done not just by white people. This was done by Black people to Black people. So reinforcing colorism and showing that they'd internalized what they've been taught by the white supremacist system. So I personally don't think that we will have a successful movement if we exclude people purely on skin tone, which is what you were just saying there. People will exclude themselves on their thought processes and their actions and behaviors, like Candice Owens. For me, she's excluded because she's showing she doesn't seem to recognize or
right. If you don't identify with, then you're excluding yourself. Then that's understandable.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But to have an actual system that excludes on skin tone is not productive, in my opinion.
Right, I agree with you. More so because, and this always reminds, I love quotes. You hear me always talking about quotes. I think hurt people. And I think this is the place that we're coming from, right? I think that historically, like you mentioned, we have emulated what the colonizer has done to us. And we've been victims, and in being victims, naturally, victims sometimes become victimizers because they're tired of being at the bottom of the barrel. They are tired of being mistreated. And I think that, yes, historically there was a point in time where we decided to now attack one another and say, hey, you're not Black enough because you're this skin color, or using this brown paper bag measure. And I think it's quite silly, because I think that you have to learn from history and do better. I don't think that we should be repeating the same mistakes from the past. I don't think it was beneficial for us then, because if you think about it, how we united then, we would probably be much further right now than we are. I mean, we're still fighting for global economic, political, social power. So when we're going back and forth about, well, you're not, your skin color is this color versus my color, I mean, we're really wasting time. If you have African blood and you identify with your African origins and your ancestry, and you're working for the productivity of people of African descent, of the African continent, of your African origins, and aligned with your our ancestors and our ancestral beliefs, then you are a vital part of the movement. Then you are needed in this movement to move forward. What we don't need is to have individuals excluding one another based on, how melanated you are or not. And that doesn't discount the fact that, we have to speak about this distrust with individuals of a lighter hue who can be white passing. That's a reality. And that's why it's important, as conscious people who, have the ability to communicate, ask questions, have a dialogue. It's important for you to connect and ask questions. And you should be able to talk to your brother or sister, or if you're confused, you should be asking these questions, but you should not be making an assumption, because you could be totally wrong. This person can be a vital part of the movement. We talk about some of our scholars. They have people that they have married that were mulattoes. Even Marcus Garvey had Amy Garvey, and her mother was a mulatto, I believe. So, we can go historically into mulattoes who have made a difference in the movement and helped us get to where we are today. So, I think that we cannot have a productive movement without including all of the diaspora, because really, let's, for example, say African Americans weren't able to preserve as much of their African origins as people in the Caribbean, let's say, because people in the Caribbean, they were just more African slaves there. So they were able to hold on to more of their African culture and roots. So in doing that, they can actually, let's say an African American and a person from the Caribbean, if they come together, the person from the Caribbean could educate the person that was in the Americas that didn't have the exposure. And likewise, the Africans on the continent, in connecting with those of the Caribbean and those of the Americas, can educate them and continue the preservation of our African origins appropriately, right? As we learn more, that we can move away from our colonizers' roots and what they imposed upon us, because we know that our African ancestors preserved as much of their African origins, but they had to do it in a manner where they were hiding, right? Like if Christianity, for example, was imposed upon them, they would or Catholicism, they would use the saints, and really the saints were they would rename them into our African gods, our African deities, and but in front of the colonizer, they would call them the saint's name that the colonizer had educated them to learn. But when they weren't around, they were actually praying to their own African gods. So I'm saying that it's really important that we connect as a diaspora, we talk about these things, and we work together for the betterment of our people. I don't think the movement is successful if that doesn't happen, because there's a dispersion of Africans all across the globe, and it has nothing to do with melanin. As you mentioned, individuals who were raped, our ancestors who were raped had children. Now they're on this island with other individuals who were also a product of that rape. And if they're intermingling, these features will change. But that African heritage and those African roots are predominantly remain. And they don't have any connection to European heritage or roots or ideals or beliefs or values or spirituality. So to answer that question, no, I don't think it would be productive.
I totally agree. I completely agree. I'm just keeping an eye on time because we've got about 5 minutes. That's just flown. That's gone. But obviously, we'll be back again talking on this show, because this is something that deserves a lot of time. Because what I see is I see pieces of people talking about this, but it never seems to come together in a way where there's people like you and I on a platform talking about it. What I see is certain celebrities who are Black mixed, talking about their experiences. Sometimes they'll say things like, well, I've never really experienced racism and I don't really think it's a problem. So things that work against the reality of what many people, every person of African origin is subjected to, whether they accept that or not, because of the system that was designed that we live in, that has evolved. So this requires so much more time. And I think that one of the things that I will say going forward is that I don't look, and this is what's important for me, I don't look anymore. I used to when I was younger. I do not look for external acceptance from anybody. The only acceptance I need in this world is from myself. And when you can go forward with that truth, so, I posted a picture of myself on World Afro Day, because my hair is quite Afro textured. It's more Afro textured than it is like my biological mother's hair, who was very straight. And I posted just saying love for World Afro Day, because I've been on my own hair journey with my Afro and not having love for it at one time. And a lady came on and she said, well, you're not Black, so you cannot. And I said to her, I absolutely can. I said, you can have that view. You can. I'm not here to tell you any different. I'm not here to fight for the right to define as Black. I know how I feel and how I see myself. And so you can have that view, but I'm not here for your acceptance. And it's a very powerful stance when you can get to that place where you're saying, I'm not here for any external acceptance. I'm going to do what feels right in here. And for me, what feels right in here is to work against the white supremacist system. And that is my commitment for life. And if you want to say, well, you can't do that because you're too light, you can't do that because you've got proximity to whiteness, you can have those views. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time trying to change that. However, if it's come from miseducation, then please let us share with you the number of people who have proximity to whiteness who denied any privilege or did not have any privilege, and worked against the white supremacist system in their own way. So for any final comments for you, sis, what would you like to end with?
I would like to say that for anyone that is expressing or trying to define Blackness, if they're not defining Blackness with being of African origin, having African blood, having African heritage, then they're not speaking of Blackness. You cannot be Black and not have African blood, African origins, and African heritage, and also have the mental ability to identify as a person of African origins. Is more than just what you see. It's also about where you come from, who you are, and we need to have these dialogues because Africans don't know, Africans don't look one way. So I think it's very important for us to speak about that, and it's very important for us not to speak from a place of fear. I think that in experiencing so much trauma, it has, and they have been setting us up against one another for so long, light skin versus dark skin, European looking individuals of African descent, against darker hue Africans. They have been setting us up against each other for so long that I think it's created this fear within the African diaspora, and there's really no reason to fear. Melanin is the predominant gene. There's not a lack of melanin. There won't be a lack of blackness. Europeans had to worry about that, but we,
exactly.
People of African descent, don't have to worry about that. And like I said, our darker skin brothers and sisters, I promote their beauty because they're beautiful. They're beautiful to me. But I'm also beautiful too. And I think that's the thing, that we need to look at one another and accept who we are and our differences in a way that is productive for us to unite. I think that we need to move away from this fear of, oh my God, if we intermingle with these people of a mixed race, then we're that have European features, then we're no longer black enough. And I think that comes from a place of fear. It comes from a place of turmoil, and it's okay to speak from a place of fear, but you have to be honest about it. You have to check yourself and say, am I speaking because I truly believe this, or am I speaking because this triggers some sort of fear within me about what's happening, right? We don't have a shortage of men, black men or women. We don't have a shortage of melanin. We don't have a shortage of like people of African descent globally. The only thing that we're lacking is unity. That's the only thing we're lacking here. And I think that once we accept that and we come together, we are a power to be reckoned with. And I think our focus really needs to be on economic, global, social, political power. And when we come together, we're beautiful and we're of different complexions, and that's what makes us unique and even more beautiful, because our differences are maybe physical, but yet our emotional, spiritual, social, political struggles are really one and the same. So I just want to say that it's one love, and I want to continue having these conversations. Yes, one love. And you mentioned even Bob Marley was married to a mulatto woman, right?
He had a child.
His brother was committed to the movement. Go ahead.
Bob had a child with a white lady. That was an interesting point, yes, because we had this conversation before. Because some people say Bob Marley is black because he's definitely Jamaican, and other people say, well, no, he's not. He's mixed race. And this conversation happened, and then I said to the guy, I said, so is children mixed race by your own breakdown? And he was like, well, no. And I said, does that include the child that he had with the white lady? Because he had a child with a white lady, which is Damian Marley. And then he was like, well, and I said, see where it's going though. You're trying to work out their blackness based on what white supremacy has taught you. That's the point that I was trying to do. Yeah.
You can't pick and choose.
Can anyone say that Bob Marley did not have love for Jamaica and Africa and for his people then? No one could say that. So why try to make him out to be not of you, not of black? Why try to do that when he had that love there? Do you know what I'm saying? There's other people that we can focus on. Yeah, true.
Yeah.
Well
This is
done.
the new black nation. This is the new black nation, and we have to be honest about that. We can't say the black nation everyone looks the same, because that would totally be discounting slavery. People say, well, you shouldn't be repeating the colonizers' tactics, and I agree. You shouldn't be repeating the colonizers' tactics by separating yourself from other people of African descent based on hue, because that helps white supremacy. So you're emulating the colonizers' tactics there. And you have to be very careful not to oppress people of African descent in the African diaspora based on hue, because now you're oppressing your own people, and you're not working towards overcoming the oppression that has impacted you overall. They even said that Jacquees Garvey was a different case. Like, her mother was like a white lady, I think. So, there's a lot of, we can go into some of our scholars and some of their history. And like I said, our darker skinned sisters deserve all the best. They deserve love, they deserve support, they deserve upliftment, and I vow to always push forward for that agenda. But in the process of that, I also want to make it very clear that it's not okay to oppress people of a lighter hue within the African diaspora. And you don't need to oppress people of a lighter hue within the African diaspora to feel black and proud. And you should feel black and proud. But remember, your blackness comes from being African. It doesn't just come from, yes, melanin can be a part of that, but it doesn't just come from being melanated. You have to have that consciousness. You have to work for the betterment of your people, and you also have to remember that we're one. We're not separated in any way, shape, or form other than geographically. And maybe we're speaking our colonizers' languages. So those differences that you hear are the product of slavery, the colonizer imposing their language upon us, their religions, and so forth. So when you see that, you should be educating your brother and sister, regardless of their hue, versus excluding them and blaming them for something that is outside of their control. They're just a product of slavery. And just like you have anti-blackness in the Americas, where women were lighting or in other countries too, where even some of our celebrities are lightening their skin, not appreciating their natural hair. You have that same anti-blackness in the Caribbean. Especially, like, I'll speak about Dominicans. There's like this whole political controversy around Dominicans being anti-black, and they are anti-black. Nobody wanted to identify as black, and we have to be honest with that, because to be black meant that you would be killed, that you would be mistreated, that you were less than, right? So now that we're coming together as an empowered community, an empowered society, is where people are now starting to identify their blackness, and we don't need to shame one another when we come across individuals who may not have reached that consciousness yet. We need to educate those individuals and say, come aboard, brother and sister, because we have a mission to accomplish here for the greater good of our African people. Yeah, so I think I said a little bit more than a few words, but
I wanted to hear it. I was speaking with you. I wanted to hear it. I think that these discussions are going to go on into the future, and I think it will be good to look at some other aspects next week. So every Saturday there will be a show led by GPAN. If you're not a follower on Facebook, there's on YouTube. Subscribe. Links, I think, are on the Facebook page for GPAN. So it was great talking to you, sister, and for everybody that's watching, much love. I hope it was an interesting discussion. Try to keep focused on it. It's hard, to host and talk and then look at the comments, but I try to keep it on as well. So hopefully we'll see people next week, and the information about what that show will be about and what will be discussed will be posted in the Facebook and on Twitter. All right, much love, people.
One love.
One love.